Okay, awesome. Yeah, there we're good. Okay. Welcome to another edition of the Saskatoon Youth Climate Committee's webinars. This week we have some special guests with us, and we're going to discuss the topic of a just transition, what that means for Saskatchewan, and how we can all be a part of that. So I'm Lauren.
I'm Marcia.
I'm Quinn.
I'm Elizabeth.
And we're the Youth Climate Committee. So if you guys would like to introduce yourselves now, that'd be awesome.
I'm Hayley. Since I jumped the gun, I'll introduce myself now. And Justin.
And I'm Justin. Thanks a lot for having us.
Yes, thanks for being here. Okay.
So are we good to go? Should I dive in to the old screen share?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Can you all see my screen? Oops. Okay. Cool. Cool. All right. So, as I said, thanks a ton for having us. Right off the beginning, I just wanted to take a second to give a shout out to one of our colleagues who's not joining us today, but really helped us with a lot of the research that we'll be talking about and the sort of case study or project that we're going to be talking about, where we spent some time talking with folks in coal-producing communities in Saskatchewan, and that's Rachel Malena-Chan. She was a key part of our team. And also kind of a shout out to everybody in Climate Justice Saskatoon who supported the work and has been part of it. That's a local grassroots organization that Hayley and I both organize with. And yeah, that's sort of where we're coming from today. But Hayley, right off the top, we thought we'd give a little bit more of an introduction of ourselves and our backgrounds. Do you want to go first?
Sure. So my name's Hayley Carlson. I have a background in environmental sciences and public policy. So I kind of have a bit of experience with the environmental and sciences side of things and also the social sciences side of things. I currently work on a research project about climate change and water based at the University of Saskatchewan. I'm also on the board of the Saskatchewan Environmental Society, and I volunteer with Climate Justice Saskatoon. And the reason I really got involved in this work, it stems back to one day when I was 14. My science teacher in high school, he had this habit of coming into the classroom and sort of reading these bad news environmental stories. And one day I just had enough of it and was like, if these problems, no one can fix them, I'm going to fix them, I guess, which was a pretty bold endeavor, but I still have yet to fix them, but I am working on some of them. And that got me into the environmental sciences. And then I realized that a lot of our problems that we experience aren't necessarily going to be solved by scientific answers. So I had to get in sort of the most social science and public policy realm, why people make the decisions they do and what kind of systemic pressures we face in society around problems like climate change and other social justice issues. Justin, I'll pass it off to you.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, my name's Justin. Right now I'm trying to get a PhD at the University of Saskatchewan in environmental history, studying the history of fossil fuel development in Saskatchewan and the province's energy history. But a lot of my time and energy goes into activism and community organizing, largely with Climate Justice Saskatoon, but I kind of got into the whole scene, I guess, more with a background in social justice. When I was younger, I used to help organize youth groups and that kind of thing around social justice issues. I was worried about climate change for a number of years, but kind of thought about it mainly as a sort of scientific technical issue that I didn't have a lot to contribute to besides selling my car and riding my bike more and that kind of thing. But when I moved away for a bit to England, and I think for me it kind of took getting out of the Saskatchewan context to really tune me into the issue and realize that there's more going on about it. So I was studying at a university in England, and there was a really active fossil fuel divestment campaign there. So I kind of jumped in, and that's where I discovered environmental history as well, and to kind of learn that if you have a background more on the humanities side of things, like the stories that we tell and that kind of thing are really important as well, which encouraged me to get involved. So yeah, it's been several years of doing this now, but I'm really excited to see more and more young folks getting involved. I certainly wasn't when I was in high school. So kudos and thanks for having us. So I will just move us along. Haley?
Sure. So I'm just going to provide you a brief look at what we're going to talk about today in this presentation. So the first one will provide a brief overview of what a just transition actually is. What does it mean? And two different but related concepts of a just transition. Then we're going to move into the conversation in Canada at large, the national conversation around a just transition, and then move into sort of the regional Saskatchewan conversation about a just transition. And then we're going to look at a case study that Justin and I were part of that he's already mentioned with our colleague Rachel and Mark about a just transition, in particular coal communities in Saskatchewan, and the work we did talking to coal workers in those communities. And then we're going to wrap it up with a few key takeaways. And as always, we like to mention that we're not necessarily experts, particularly when it comes to the community work that we did with Estevan and Coronach. We're not trying to speak on behalf of them in any way. We just are people who have a significant stake in the conversation and have, in our spare time, gone and talked to some people in coal communities about a just transition, and we're just sharing our experience doing that work with you today.
Indeed, and thanks for mentioning Mark. I should have mentioned him off the top because he's the other person who is directly involved in this work and is still working on a bit more of the technical side of things in terms of what does an electricity grid in Saskatchewan without coal actually look like. So maybe that's a future conversation. But for our part, for Hayley, Rachel, and I, we were kind of interested more in the social side of things and this concept of a just transition. So we just wanted to start there because energy transitions are as much social issues as they are technical ones. The energy systems that we have in place have really significant implications for how our entire society is organized. And that includes, but is not just limited to, what people do for work. And so it's critical that we discuss all the social elements of the transition if we want to get it right. If we're limiting ourselves just to what that means technically, then we're missing a big part of the conversation. So today we're going to talk about two different types or levels of just transitions that are by no means mutually exclusive and in fact are complementary. First is transition planning for fossil fuel workers in communities. And second is a justice-based societal transition away from fossil fuels. We'll look at both because they're both critical pieces of this. First of all, we have to do right by working communities if we expect them to buy into the process and don't mean to force them to bear the brunt of the cost of that transition. And this point I think also speaks a bit to some of the roots of climate change denial in the province, which we'll maybe talk a little bit more later. And then secondly, we have to also broaden the conversation in order for it to really be a truly just transition and to sort of reckon with the implications of what that transformation of our energy system means for us, because that has a lot of implications for people in urban centers as well. So first of all, usually when we hear or talk about the term just transition in the media or from the government, say, it's in a policy context that is geared towards fossil fuel workers and their communities. This term of a just transition didn't originate with fossil fuel workers, but that's usually what we're talking about today because that's a very pressing issue in the media and for our government. You might still hear this in relation to other industries, like say the aviation industry, for example. Like that's another one that may be phased out or radically altered by climate policy, and I've seen some talk about a just transition for people who work in that industry. But right now we'll talk about it in the context of fossil fuel workers. And basically just transition planning gives us a chance to avoid the devastation that industry closures often bring to local communities. And Saskatchewan is no stranger to this. If you drive around the province, there's lots of ghost towns these days, from industries leaving, the railroad closing, all those sorts of things. So we have a chance now with a lot of foresight to try and avoid some of that issue. And this chart on here just kind of shows what a big issue this is for workers in Saskatchewan. Almost 3% of our workforce and almost 20% of our GDP are directly tied to the fossil fuel industry. There are a lot of indirect effects as well, but it's just, yeah, it's quite a pressing issue. It's only a bigger issue for Alberta, really, and Newfoundland and Labrador is pretty serious as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, if we're talking about what this means for workers, then these are some of the key elements that we need to be thinking about in terms of what a just transition means and can look like. These points are pulled out of this report that was published just in April of this year that looked at literature from around the world that were examining the idea of a just transition for fossil fuel communities in a variety of contexts in China and India, Australia, United States, and Canada. And they pulled out, in this report, they pulled out 17 key elements that need to be a part of just transition planning. And I've sort of tried to condense them here into fewer points. I don't know if I'll list them all off, but they're here for people to read. But effectively, the idea is that we need all levels of government working together on this. No one level of government can tackle it on their own. And really crucially, we need the communities that are most impacted to be involved themselves in that process. And I think these points will kind of come out more clearly as we're talking about our experience and where things are at policy-wise. But now I'll just pass it over to Hayley to talk a little bit about what has actually happened so far.
So much of the conversation around a just transition nationally in Canada has been very narrow. It's been largely focused on just coal communities. So the timeline you can see on this slide, it starts with October 2016, and that was relatively soon after our current Liberal government was elected in their first term. They had run on a campaign of climate action. They started making a series of announcements, and one of those announcements was a coal phase out, that they were going to, they had the intention at least to phase out traditional coal-fired electricity by 2030. And then they eventually later that year, in December of that year, released the Pan-Canadian Framework on Climate Change, which is our current national policy framework for addressing climate change across Canada. And so then at that point in time, they hadn't really talked about what that means for the communities that depend on coal, or indeed the electricity systems across our nation that depend on coal. And they did start working with the UK and some other partners to launch what they called the Powering Past Coal Global Alliance, which did include a commitment to a just transition, but they hadn't really enacted anything in Canada at that point in time. So we're really seeing here nationally in Canada just transition considerations coming retroactively after the policy announcement around coal and other things had already been made. So in April of 2018, which was the year after, the federal government announced the Just Transition Task Force, and this was made up of a series of experts that came from a bunch of different sectors in society. And this task force was supposed to travel to different communities affected by a coal phase out, talk to those people about what a coal phase out would mean. And they visited Estevan and Coronach, which are the two primary communities in Saskatchewan that depend on or have primary coal industries, in June of 2018. And then later in 2019, they released two reports on their findings, essentially. And I don't think their findings are really rocket science. You can imagine when you make a policy announcement that's going to affect a certain group of people, you should probably talk to those people. So that was one of their findings from the report, that affected communities should be communicated with and involved in decision-making if possible. The other thing is that government action on this needs to be sustainable and timely to reduce disruption. So the longer you delay on thinking about affected communities, the more disrupted those communities are going to be ultimately from your policy, whatever your policy is. And you can check out this report online. There's quite a few recommendations. I'll just share a couple that spoke to me personally. So one of them was establishing local just transition centers. So these would be established in the affected communities, and this would be really the hub where people were coming to explore ideas about creating different economic sources for the community and social supports. And then the other one was, this is kind of boring, I guess, but to me, I think it's useful, is to create an inventory of labor market information, because we actually don't know who are the people who are employed in the coal industry. What kind of skills do they have? Are they near retirement, so we don't actually need to think about what jobs they might get into next? Or do they have sets of skills that could be easily placed in other industries, like the solar industry or the wind industry? And then, of course, the other one is funding, to create a comprehensive funding program, because if you can imagine, if you're just doing this in a very piecemeal way, you're not going to have real transition happen in those communities. It'll just be sort of project-based, small funding opportunities. And there is talk federally right now. There's no sort of final say on this, but federally they're talking about introducing what they're calling a Just Transition Act. And this is to facilitate the transition of fossil fuel workers into a low carbon global economy. That's what they're saying. And so this could be released in 2020. And in normal times, I would have expected an announcement in the lead up to the United Nations Climate Conference this November. But that conference, of course, has been delayed. And we're currently probably going to see a delay just because of the current pandemic situation. And I think it's the next slide, Justin.
Yeah. So just before we get a little bit more into what's happening specifically in Saskatchewan and the work that we did talking with community members, we just wanted to talk a little bit about the second concept of a just transition, the broader one. And I think, this is really timely, both because of the pandemic that we're all living through right now, but also with a lot of the racial injustice that's been rightly dominating the news lately. Because this broader concept is really about how a lot of these crises intersect with each other. So for quite a few years now, climate justice advocates have been working to expand this idea of a just transition to be about more than just people employed directly in the fossil fuel industry, and to include all of society, which again helps us recognize both the social implications of transforming our energy system, the fact that that has implications for our lives as well, but also to think about how to make that transition in a way that helps address these other problems, which are really some of the root causes of climate change, like wealth inequality, perpetual growth, colonialism, racism, etc. The Green New Deal, which most people by now have probably heard quite a bit about, is probably one of the most visible expressions of this sort of framework and visioning of addressing climate change in a way that is getting at some of the other issues as well. And now the pandemic and sort of the economic crisis that is causing is starting to inspire coordinated calls around the world and across this country for something called a just recovery, or a people's bailout from the situation that we're in. Of course, and as everybody's noticed, the pandemic has really exposed a lot of the vulnerabilities in our current system for everybody to see. Anybody that was ignoring them before, willfully or otherwise, will have a much harder time doing that now. And I think, learning from past experiences, we know that we need to be really ambitious in what we ask for in coming out of these types of crises, and really organized in how we go about doing that. Because this is about recovering from the current crisis, but also about mitigating future crises, whether that's other pandemics or the climate crisis itself. So just on the bottom of the screen here, I have the 5 principles that were sort of internationally agreed upon for what a just recovery should be based on. There's actually a 6th one that's been added for the Canadian context that Climate Justice Saskatoon is a signatory to, and that's to respect Indigenous rights and take leadership from Indigenous peoples. That's a really important one, obviously, in this context. And the other 5 that have been sort of agreed on by groups around the world are to put people's health first without exception, given that this is a health crisis, people's health needs need to be prioritized, to provide an economic relief directly to the people, and relatedly to help workers in communities and not corporate executives. And I think this is a big lesson out of the 2008 financial crisis, when we saw a lot of corporate bailouts, and sort of cost downgraded onto the rest of us in civil society. Number 4 is creating resilience for future crises, which kind of gets us at this idea of addressing root causes and examining what's really to blame here. And finally, build solidarity and community across borders, and not empowering authoritarians. I think we see often in these situations people like Donald Trump, like we're seeing now, move to sort of consolidate their power at the expense often of marginalized communities. And there are ways that we can respond that don't play into that. So, of course, these types of broad principles and frameworks are really useful for recognizing and defining the problem and starting to get us organized. What solutions actually look like vary a lot by context. What a just recovery looks like in Saskatoon than in Toronto, than in Mexico City, etc. And so it's really key to have local conversations about that. And I just wanted to mention that one thing Climate Justice Saskatoon is interested in working on right now is getting conversations going about what that could and should look like in Saskatoon and in Saskatchewan. What sorts of policies would we like to see prioritized that can help us recover from the pandemic in terms of health, in terms of our economy, and in a way that gets us on track for climate change. Because as we're about to talk about, even when it comes to the climate conversation and the just transition conversation with workers, we're pretty far behind in Saskatchewan. So maybe this is an opportunity to jumpstart some of those conversations as well.
I just wanted to add here, actually, Justin, before we go on to the other slide, this is off our notes, but I'll just note that early indications are, particularly around environmental sort of stewardship, that a lot of jurisdictions in the world are using this pandemic situation as an opportunity to skirt their responsibilities around environmental stewardship and protection. So we're seeing provinces like Alberta and Ontario start to roll back reporting requirements and consultation requirements for industries. And there has been large corporations across Canada that have asked for essentially lax regulations given the challenges established by the pandemic situation. So this isn't, I would consider this to be against the principles of what a green recovery or just recovery would entail. So just, keeping your eyes on that and submitting, signing petitions or submitting letters is good. Is that a hand that I see? I'm not sure. Is there a question? Yes.
It's sort of more of a comment on that, but just like, these entire industries don't have to, keep up with their very, very important job of reporting on what's going on, but we still have to go to school. We still gotta pay our student fees. No one is off the hook right now.
Yeah, it's a really bizarre situation. I mean, we've seen businesses across the country lobby for rent relief, which to some extent makes a lot of sense, but there's been no rent relief for people in terms of housing. It's a really bizarre and imbalanced situation. So that's a good point.
Yeah, you're really seeing corporations get protected where you're not seeing the same protections for communities, which should be prioritized in this situation. So we'll see how things are, keep going out as the pandemic is still obviously a prominent issue. But early indications, for me at least, are that we're not seeing these elements of a green recovery introduced in Canada.
I'll just quickly plug this. It's getting old now, a 15-year-old book by Naomi Klein called The Shock Doctrine, because this is a really classic shock doctrine moment where when there are these very public crises, corporations in particular take the opportunity to try and exploit it to their advantage. But a key element of that whole framework is that if we recognize what's going on and can be organized, there's actually an opportunity for us to really fight back against that and win something like a just recovery. So I think that's a really good point, Hayley, that so far things aren't going great. And that's why we need to change the conversation.
Okay, I'll go back to the notes now. So I'm not sure how much sort of you guys or the audience will know about what's going on in Saskatchewan around climate change. But our official framework or policy framework for addressing climate change in the province is called Prairie Resilience, and they're calling it a Made in Saskatchewan climate change strategy. And this is largely because they very much opposed carbon pricing being introduced in the province. So they went ahead with their own framework. And there is some talk in this framework about supporting livelihoods and fostering people's capacity to take advantage of new opportunities, new industries that may emerge. However, they haven't used the phrase just transition. And when you pair Prairie Resilience with the Saskatchewan Growth Plan, which overall aims to expand Saskatchewan's existing industries, including oil and gas, the implications are that they're going to be trying to protect people's jobs and livelihoods through a lot of what we already have here, a lot of the same industries we already have, instead of transitioning to a new energy economy. And so they're just looking to really reduce the carbon intensity of our existing industries. And there's no real recognition of the social struggles that will inevitably emerge around and already exist around climate change and transitioning to a different sort of energy economy, or indeed addressing these broader concepts of a justice-based transition. And I was involved in some of the early conversations around the third report you see on that page, which is essentially, we're calling it a resilience measures report card. It's supposed to be the way we track how well we're doing on our climate change initiatives. And there was some talk about putting a measure in there around tracking how many people are employed, again, in renewable energy industries or other sorts of alternative industries that are low carbon. However, that was eventually scrapped in the latest version. So I would say, although there is a narrow conversation going on nationally around a just transition, there's really, really not a lot of talk going on in Saskatchewan about what a just transition is or what it means, even in the narrow conceptualization focused on coal communities.
Next one.
Sure, I don't know what's next. Oh, awesome. Okay,
Surprise.
So before we have this after what we're going to talk about next, but so we have mentioned Estevan and Coronach quite a few times. I think Justin may give you a bit more detail about what sort of the characteristics of those communities are, but like I mentioned before, they were they are the primary coal producing communities in Saskatchewan, and we did our work there with our interviews with folks. And since the main phase of our work ended in those communities in about the spring of 2019, there have been some funding announcements, both federally and provincially, announcing some initial support for those communities to, in the light of the impending coal phase out, which the deadline for that is 2030. So the federal government announced 1.3 million for those particular communities, and they also made a commitment of 35 million over 5 years in the budget in 2018. And then provincially, the Saskatchewan government has pledged 10 million for those communities and the regions that surround them, so the regional economies. And so there have been some interesting ideas explored. We definitely see some interest still in those communities and energy resources or energy sources that Climate Justice Saskatoon wouldn't necessarily support, such as carbon capture and storage technology or nuclear power. But we're also seeing something like they recently initiated a solar installation training program at a college in Estevan. They've both Coronach and Estevan have established sort of hubs, community hubs of discussion and action around what the sort of regional alternative economic opportunities might be. And they've also created in Coronach what they're calling a Deep South Economic Partnership. So that's just a partnership of them and a bunch of other organizations and municipalities in the region to explore alternative economic opportunities such as tourism or alternative agricultural pursuits that they can look into and perhaps pursue in that area. So this is very early days for these communities, and a lot of these funding has been very piecemeal. Like we're only looking at 8.8 million for Estevan and 2.4 million for Coronach, but it's just, a piecemeal project-based funding opportunity at this point in time. And I don't want to say this is exciting times for them, because obviously it's a very difficult situation that they're in, and they're going to be in a lot of ways the pilot project for Saskatchewan on this. But it is a very interesting endeavor to see what they're going through, and all of the efforts they're putting in for the communities. This is very real. This is coming. It's happening. So they need to figure out alternatives, and they all, as you will hear later in our talk about our work down there, they all really love their communities and want to stay in their communities. So they're really trying to thrive where they are, if possible, by exploring some of these alternative options for them.
Yeah, so I realize that we're definitely going to go a little bit over time here, because we're only just starting to talk about this project, and we're at about a half hour. But I think it's interesting that one of the motivations for doing this work, for going down to these communities, talk with folks there, was that none of that was happening in the province. Nobody was talking about a just transition. And even now, a couple of years later, or a little over a year since we finished that, the conversation still isn't that far ahead. It is advancing, but it's not quite where we maybe expect to see it. But I'll let Hayley kind of introduce what we did, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we learned there, and then we can open it up for questions.
Okay, so I think we've pretty much given away what we did, but yeah, I guess our inspiration for this was, we were like, wow, obviously we need to address climate change. And one of the ways we can address climate change in Saskatchewan is by phasing out coal, which is a huge part of our electricity generating capacity here in Saskatchewan. But we were like shocked that no one was talking about that, or what it meant for the communities that depend on coal. Very directly, obviously we all indirectly depend on coal. And we also were interested in what is sort of blocking progress on the conversation around phasing out coal, and the social aspects of what could be blocking progress on that. So what we did essentially is we went down to Estevan and Coronach, and we did interviews with members of those communities. I think Justin's going to talk a bit more about that. But what we were really motivated in was how do we push forward for a coal phase out while accounting for the costs for these communities, why nobody's talking about it, what might be those blocking elements, and what would happen if we talked about a phase out of coal and climate change in essentially potentially the most volatile communities in Saskatchewan. These people really believe in coal and want to see it go forward. And so we knew, as environmental activists, which is how we identified ourselves to them, there would probably be quite a few things we might not be able to agree on. But what could we agree on was sort of the premise. And I'll pass it off to you, Justin.
Yeah, so just quickly, these are the communities. You can see the little C and the little E for Coronach and Estevan. This is a map of Saskatchewan, of course, or part of it. Interestingly, it's also a map of the solar potential in the province. So yeah, that's just interesting, I guess. But the communities are both quite near the American border, but they're also quite different. Estevan is a city of about a little over 10,000 people. It's a little bit diversified. There's a lot of oil and gas there, a lot of agriculture and other industry, transportation, etc. But the coal industry has always sort of been a bedrock there. Coal mining has happened in the region since the end of the 1800s. And that's really been the heart of Saskatchewan's coal industry for a long time. Coronach, meanwhile, is a very small town today of only about 600 people. It was before that a little farming community. In the 70s and 80s, when SaskPower decided to open a second coal mine and a power plant there called Poplar River, a lot of people moved to the community. The population expanded to a little over 1,000. It's not quite there anymore, but really that's the industry that's there. A lot of people still farm, but a lot of people that farm there also work in coal. And sort of how we went about this is we just kind of worked through contacts that we had. If we knew anybody that lived or had lived in these communities, contact other people that worked in the communities, and asking if folks wanted to talk. We had quite a lot of interest, wound up having time to sit down for 17 interviews that were mostly around an hour long. with a lot of people that worked directly in coal, either in mines or in the plants, some people that worked sort of in town administration, in farming, etc. And a lot of times the same person would do all of those things because they are small communities. So yeah, you might be a town councillor and a coal miner and you farm as well. So it's quite an interesting experience. And yeah, based on those 17 interviews, we produced a report which was released at the end of 2018. And then in the spring of 2019, Hayley, Rachel, and Mark and I went back to the communities and ran some workshops to talk about sort of what we'd found, why we'd done the report, and to try and envision some next steps for those communities and really re-emphasize, I guess, that the reason we were interested in this work is that, you know, we're advocating for really strong climate action, but also want to find ways to advocate for these communities so that they're not essentially left behind. So we'll just quickly cycle through some of what we thought our key takeaways were. We've sort of got it down to 5 here. In our report, if you're interested in reading it, we have a series of, I think, 10 or 11 recommendations for the province and folks in the province, but these I think were sort of our key learnings. So first of all, it was that each community is facing unique challenges and opportunities specific to their context. Kind of when we started the project, we thought of them just monolithically as quote unquote coal communities, but as I already outlined, they're actually quite different. And the phase out of coal means different things for them. I found in talking with people there that in Estevan, people more or less seemed quite defiant about the idea of phasing out coal because they have carbon capture and storage there, and just really weren't on board with the idea. Whereas in Coronach, people seemed a little bit more resigned to the idea, and part of that is that the Poplar River plant is nearing the end of its life cycle already. But in any case, in both cases, the phase out of coal is really just compounding broader issues, and in particular, a process of rural decline that has been afflicting the province for many, many years, where small communities have been losing services, not having their infrastructure repaired or renewed, and that sort of thing. So it wasn't really a standalone issue for those communities.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, like, that for me was a really clear reminder that policies like coal phase out seem not viable when we have like a culture of austerity where we're not investing in communities, where we're not investing in infrastructure and social supports for people. It makes transitioning away from fossil fuels seem less and less viable. So clearly that has to be part of our solution going forward. The other thing, I think the number one thing that we came out of those communities feeling like we had in common with them is that we both parties felt left out and let down by decision makers. We felt like Justin and Rachel and I felt like no one was really talking about what we really needed to do about climate change and transitioning as rapidly as we do need to away from fossil fuels, whereas these communities felt like, you know, there was these government bureaucrats sitting in Ottawa deciding their future. They thought that environmentalists were controlling them, by the way, which we found very surprising, and because we thought they were controlling decision makers. So in that way, there was some solidarity between us because we both kind of felt like, whoa, what is happening if no one feels like they're being reflected in the decisions that are being made? And I'll let you go talk about climate change in our stories, Justin.
Sure, yeah. Who are these decisions even being made for? This one was really important as well, and it was clear quickly that climate change plays different roles in our collective stories. I don't think it's surprising that regions with high levels of dependence on fossil fuels also tend to have the highest levels of climate denialism. So that's true of Southeast Saskatchewan. It's also true of Northern Alberta around the oil sands. Of course, those communities are heavily invested in the status quo, and so if there aren't viable alternatives, they'll really hang on to that. So it's interesting that for us as climate justice advocates, I mean, climate change is the whole reason that we're interested in this issue and that we're doing this. That's why coal needs to be phased out. Whereas for these communities, it was climate change policy that is sort of seen as the existential threat. That's what's challenging or threatening the viability of their jobs and livelihoods in their communities ultimately. And so we think it's really important to try and bridge that gap to some extent. I mean, to increase climate literacy there, probably particularly by talking about its local relevance, what that means for the community there, and yeah, just understanding that it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing for everybody. But we tried to emphasize that that was really our motivation, I suppose.
Yeah, it was we thought about climate change very, very, very differently than these community folks did. And in terms of alternatives, I mean, this is always sort of a thing that people are like, well, you know, it would be nice to get away from coal, but there's actually no alternatives out there. So we did talk to them a bit about what they thought about alternatives to generate energy here. And we had different ideas about what they could do, I guess. I think oftentimes these community folks seem to think that environmentalists were portraying of these alternative energy sources like solar, like wind energy, as sort of this utopian energy source that has no fallbacks to it, like there's no weaknesses to it. But of course that's not true. It causes us to be a bit more reflective about our narrative around those particular energy sources. But in general, people thought that things like renewables were highly unreliable. You know, the sun doesn't always shine, the wind doesn't always blow, that the price would be too high for them. It wouldn't be enough to meet the demand that we're going to have for energy in Saskatchewan, either now or in the future. And that it's hard to fix or maintain these systems in remote, harsh communities with you know, very cold winters, and there might not be someone nearby who can maintain the equipment. And then ironically, some people even talk to us about the environmental problems associated with these, like, you know, the wind turbines kill bats and birds and things like that. And we'll go maybe on to the next point, Justin.
Sure, yeah, just lastly and quickly, there was definitely a desire we heard to hear from experts on the issue, to, you know, shore up knowledge and understanding of these alternatives and how they might work there, and a variety of them. And that's a piece where we thought more folks in the province can and should get involved in terms of bringing their expertise to bear. Folks also wanted to hear from other communities that are facing these issues and finding ways to develop alternatives. Of course, Coronach and Estevan are by no means alone in this. There are communities around the world that are facing the same problem. But crucially, there was definitely and clearly a desire to be intimately involved in the planning process. So as much as they want to hear from other people and you know, draw on expertise and experience from elsewhere, really these people are the experts on what this means for their community and what types of alternatives might work there. So that was an important one and maybe a good one to end on. We had some key messages. Maybe since we're at about 40 minutes, we'll just leave this one up that folks can read, because it just sort of recaps what we talked about. I'll put this up for 1 second just so you have our information and where to find us if you want to ask more questions. But we can open it up for a few minutes for questions if folks have any. Thanks for listening.
Yeah, okay, so I'm not sure how we want to do this, if we want to keep the screen up in the background for a little bit, but I know I have a few questions. Does anyone want to start?
Can I just bring this back to not screen share?
Sure, yeah, we'll do that for now and then.
Oops. Hello.
Awesome. Okay, so does anybody want to start?
Go. I know I have a question that's quite similar to Lizzie's that we talked about earlier, but I just wanted to ask about the role that you think climate education in general could play in expanding this narrative and just helping share different perspectives.
Justin, do you want to go first? You're opening your mouth.
Sure. I mean, just to start with, on a basic level, I mean, I think that it is really important that you know, there is more understanding about you know, why it's so important and sort of the logic behind these types of policies. We did think that, and I sort of mentioned this on the last slide, but there's definitely room for changing the way that we talk about it, perhaps away from sort of these sometimes high-level abstract ideas of a changing climate. We heard a lot of concerns about what a small contributor Saskatchewan and Canada are, which isn't really necessarily true, but it's certainly the perception amongst a lot of people. But it might be really useful to talk more about local climate impacts and what it means in Saskatchewan, what that's going to mean for agriculture in the province and for folks in these communities. So I think that we need to consider a little bit how we're going to talk about it, but it's going to be a key part of moving forward. Hayley?
Yeah, just to follow up, I mean, I think what Justin said, local impacts are really key, because there's a lot of research out there that shows the more you can translate climate change in terms of local impacts and what those impacts mean for people's health, for people's economic livelihoods, things like that, the more it resonates with them and the more they understand and are willing to talk about solutions. And then I think practically what I'd really like to see climate or education in general bring in is practical ways to talk to people who maybe don't share your opinion in a way that can, get us away from polarized, siloed conversations and more to multi-stakeholder conversations where we can all hear equally each other's perspectives and move forward collaboratively on solutions, because I think sometimes that contributes to us really being at a standstill.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think sort of on that point, that another element of the whole climate change education thing that's important, I think, is talking more about the sort of social side of things and the just transition thing, because even as climate change activists, this certainly isn't true of everybody, but a lot of people who are concerned about climate change don't give a lot of thought about what that means for working people and communities that are going to be impacted by those policies. So the more that we're all able to educate ourselves and each other, I think the more we'll be able to move away from that polarization. And having conversations with each other is a big part of that, which is why we were kind of excited to do that work.
Yeah, and another thing that I was going to ask about directly relating to climate education is kind of what advice you would give to young people like ourselves who are looking to get into the workforce and are kind of struggling with the idea of how the economy might be changing and what the future looks like for jobs. So is there anything around that you could address?
Justin, you got a PhD instead of going and getting a job.
Trying to get one.
Get a PhD. That's our advice.
I don't know about that. Gosh, that's a really hard question.
Yeah, it's super hard. I guess, like, for me, I've been super privileged. I mean, I work on the climate change research project at the university, which is like one of, I think, like an ideal project for a climate activist, obviously. And I say I'm privileged in the sense that I was really able to follow my heart. Like I was interested in how we make decisions about it. I did a master's in public policy, and then I got a job. My first job was with an environmental nonprofit, and I got that through volunteering. So I guess, like, my advice would be I mean, this sounds super, I don't know. Sorry, I'm not meaning to be like, I recognize this is a very real struggle, but to get involved in things and volunteer if possible and take initiative. And I feel like for a young person also who really cares about these issues, it might be hard to actually feel comfortable being involved in certain jobs just with the society we have, and not just because that industry might not exist anymore, but maybe that industry isn't in line with your principles and values around what you think we need to do as a society. So it's just building resilience to a lot of change. I imagine there's going to be a lot of change in the next few decades, particularly. I don't know, I don't think that was helpful at all. I'm sorry.
No, that's definitely, that was a really big question, and I probably should have broken that down a little bit more. Yeah, just a lot of people I know, especially around our age, are feeling anxious about, is this job going to exist in 20 years? Or if by achieving a just transition, am I still going to be in a good economic standing with the career that I've chosen or the schooling path that I've taken? So yeah, I know a lot of young people are quite anxious about that, and yeah.
I'm not particularly, I don't know if I fall into the young category anymore, but I mean, even for me, I still feel that a lot. And I can just talk for a second about my personal experience that for years, I've just sort of been bouncing around in the, maybe not exactly in the gig economy, but, you know, doing retail work here, doing research contracts there, kind of whatever I was able to. And part of the decision to go back to graduate school was, like, I kind of joked that it was for stability, not that grad school is notoriously unstable. I'm super lucky that it sort of turned out to be that case with the pandemic, which is just like a weird situation to be in. But I mean, even for me, I identify that with that completely. Like, I don't know what things are going to look like in even 5 or 10 years. So it's hard to plan in that way. That's sort of one of the great struggles of my life, I feel like. And just sort of to Hayley's point, I mean, I think the key thing, if you're concerned about these issues, is just to find ways to be involved. It's not always going to be possible or easy to find work in this area, but I mean, you are all involved in advocacy now, which is great. And I'd say just keep doing that, and possibilities will open up one way or another.
Yeah, there's lots of ways to get involved, not to self-promo, but we're a great way, especially young people. But Climate Justice Saskatoon is also awesome. I've got to work with them in the past, and yeah, you guys are a great example. And From the Ground Up is another really great resource. Your guys' podcast. I was lucky enough to record last year before all this happened, but those are some great perspectives and different ways to get involved too if you're sitting at home and you're looking for something to do or ways to get involved.
In conclusion, watch our webinars.
Yes, I think that's the general takeaway from that whole promo thing.
Support your local youth climate committee.
Yeah, I don't know if we're the only one, but you know. Okay. All right, so does anybody have any other questions or anything you want to touch on? Lizzie, yeah.
Lizzie, you're muted.
Yeah, Lizzie, you're muted.
Lizzie.
Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yes.
Hi. Okay. I have 2 questions. I'm just going to ask one and then allow your answers and then ask the other afterwards so I don't forget. I was just wondering, with the delays in passing legislation around making a just transition, and it's slowed because of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was just wondering if you had an estimate as to how much time we can afford to put off these things in order to reach goals we have for both Saskatchewan and also in relation to the carbon emission goals we have in relation to the United Nations agreement.
Okay, well, that's an easy one. We should have done this decades ago. We're already late, unfortunately. And with just transition, I mean, I can't give you a firm date, but there's the earlier you start planning, like we have 10 years to revolutionize these communities, essentially, particularly SFAN, which is a really big, and that's just 2 coal communities, let alone our whole society, which, you know, we need to be at net zero emissions by 2050, 2060. Like, that's coming up very rapidly. So, you know, yesterday we should have been doing all of this stuff.
I will
55 years ago is the answer.
Yeah.
Indeed. I will just note very, very cautiously optimistically that I think it's a good sign that communities and activists have been putting enough pressure, certainly on the federal government for years now, that they at least can't avoid the question, like when it comes to the pandemic and they're talking about economic bailouts and packages, they can't avoid that question anymore of, you know, when Trudeau announced some of the measures, he said, you know, we can't ignore the environment now. Some of their money for the oil industry was tied to tighter regulations and remediation of oil wells and that kind of thing. A lot of them are half measures and maybe some distraction, but I think it is promising that pressure has built to the point that's at least an integral part of the conversation, and I'd say we need to keep that up.
Yeah, and I will say, sorry, that was a bit like pessimistic, but I mean, I'm 29 and I can see since I was that 14-year-old in that classroom, like how much the policy discourse has shifted on this. it's made certain things a lot harder to get away with, and options like, you know, renewables and other things seem like much more viable solutions than they would have been thought of when I was 14. So I will say that we are moving that way. It's just a matter of like, will we get there in line with our global ambitions around 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees?
Yeah, and another important part of that we're also really trying to connect back to is vote if you can. We have civic and provincial elections coming up in the fall. And if you can't vote, tell your parents to vote, tell your friends to vote, whatever it looks like that. Pressuring the government is important, and having that shift. I'm a plaintiff in the La Rose versus Her Majesty the Queen lawsuit. So something we're really focused on is government accountability. So your vote is one way to do that, and some youth don't have the right to vote, so that's why it's that much more important to have your voice heard.
Okay, and if we have time for the last question I have, I don't know if anyone else does. I was just wondering, you were talking about the skill sets that could be transferable to other jobs for people who do work in the coal industry. And I was just wondering, out of the renewable energy sources we have denoted as viable, is there a specific one or a few that would allow for those transferable skills to be applied from coal workers?
Yes, there is. The problem is we don't have a lot of Saskatchewan specific data, so we don't actually always know who are, like, as I said, who are these people, what sort of training education they have, what skill sets they have, just so we can actually say like 60% of these skills are transferable to other industries. There has been some studies done out of the US for particular local economies that I've read as high as like 60% of skills are actually directly transferable to the solar industry, but I would caution that statistic is very much localized, and that's why I'm really hoping to see Saskatchewan / the national government go forward with, I mean, it would be nice to have a national skills inventory, which is something the Just Transition Task Force had advocated for, just so, you know, we can look at transferring across provinces and regions and things like that. But yeah, definitely there are transferable skills. I don't know if Justin, if you want to follow up on that.
The other thing that I would mention is that one concern that has come out of these communities that I think is quite justified is that even though there are transferable skills, and that's a really positive thing, the number of jobs that will be available in those industries are probably not going to compare to what there are in coal today. One of the authors of the study I had up in the slides, Sandeep Pai, has kind of reviewed coal communities around the world and found that in a lot of these communities there is really high solar potential, but the jobs replacement potential isn't as good as you would hope for it to be. So it'll work out for some of the workers, but that's why we also need to kind of broaden our thinking of sort of post-fossil fuel jobs beyond just renewable energy, because those same skills can also potentially transfer into other industries altogether. But that's why it's important to think through and take leadership from these communities and how they can sort of have a vibrant, diversified situation there as these industries are phased out.
I was going to follow up on that point, Justin, because that's a great point. And the other point I think would be around the wages associated with these different jobs. I think that there was some resistance in folks we talked to about perhaps jobs that don't offer the kind of wages they're used to and they've built a lifestyle around. So that's a whole like other elephant in a room that we haven't really talked about, but I think we're going to have to grapple with as a society.
Yeah, and I think with wages specifically, like the estimations for what they might look like probably aren't really indicative of what the situation would be if we were to get rid of coal and fossil fuels, because I don't know if the wages estimation is based on like, you know, working in the solar industry now or a prediction, but I mean, we can't really know. Like, I'm sure that it would end up being equal, if not more. I mean, if less people are employed, then there's like probably higher wages, which isn't like good, but I
think it really depends also how we go about it as well. You know, there's a route to try and ensure that jobs that are replacing these ones are strong unionized jobs, or publicly financed jobs and that sort of thing. But we could also leave it to, to corporations to sort of set the rates, and then we don't know. But you're quite right that like we don't know what the situation will be. The cost of living can change quite dramatically with different energy sources and that thing. So it's a really hard thing to calculate. But I think it's a concern that we need to be aware of addressing.
Yeah, and I would say, like, I hope that, we are trying to build a society where people don't feel like they have to make, 100,000 a year to actually receive health benefits. Or I hope that we're building a society that provides enough social support and doesn't pursue austerity to make people get away from this, or have people feel comfortable to move away from the scarcity mentality, and that they can rely on their neighbors a lot more than perhaps people feel today, which will hopefully mitigate some of the concerns around, we need to make a certain amount to just live and have a healthy lifestyle.
Yeah, one of the sorry, this is like a little bit off topic, but one of the things about solar power that I think is really cool is that
SOTUS.
Tell your cat I love them. But one of the things that's really cool about solar power is like the potential for self-sustainability, like with communities and even households. Just because, I mean, like if you or your community can afford to like install the infrastructure, then there's the potential to become like completely self-sustainable, which is something that's very, very different from anything that involves mining. And like I think that like my personal strategy idea for like how we should implement solar and wind power is like going to indigenous communities first, and implementing like solar and wind farms. And because I think that like just, I mean, based on my sort of limited white knowledge of how reserves work, like one of the biggest problems that they face is like relying on the government, like, which is like a huge thing that's been like caused by a system, and it's a vicious cycle. But like the depending on the government is really bad, and I think that like by putting solar farms in reserve communities, or however they would want to do it, would be a way to improve like quality of life, and also would put less demand on non-renewable energies in the rest of the province. I don't know where I'm going with this. I'm sorry.
No, I think that's a great point. Well, go ahead, Justin.
No, please. I'll go after.
Okay. Well, I would say that there's a lot of Indigenous communities across Canada actually leading in that action themselves.
Yeah.
And some of that initiative has already taken place. So I think that would be completely compatible with, and should be a priority in a just transition framework.
Yeah, like in our last webinar, we talked a little bit about Cowessess First Nation, which has been like probably the best example for like Saskatchewan communities in general. And I mean, for any community that's like interested in like implementing solar and wind power, they're just a really great example.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just note that Indigenous Climate Action is a really good organization to follow on this topic. They're helping to try and build climate change education and resilience in First Nations across Canada. And I was going to note too that there's another webinar series going on that you might already know about, that a number of partners have put together. Climate Justice Saskatoon has sponsored it, and the Saskatchewan Environmental Society is sort of doing the logistical work behind. But Jenna Gall from the First Nations Power Authority is doing a presentation, I'm pretty sure in the near future here, about that topic of renewable energy and First Nations. So you might be interested in checking that out.
Awesome.
Yeah. All right, so I think we're gonna wrap things up. thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your knowledge and all your expertise about these topics. It was really great to get to meet you and learn from you. So yeah, thank you so much. Check out Climate Justice Saskatoon. They're a great organization and they've helped us a lot. So go check out what they're doing over there. And then Warsha, do you want to intro what our topic next week is?
I'm actually not sure about the topic next week. But I would say that we will be releasing survey information about that as soon as we can, because we want students to come in and share their perspectives and share some of the questions that they want us to post for them. So stay tuned about that. It's kind of difficult to figure things out exactly with COVID, but as soon as we know what exactly is going on, we will be updating everyone. And this is just a platform to allow young voices to get involved in the conversation.
Thanks so
I
much
believe
for
we'll
having us.
be chatting with Peter Preble and Ann Coxworth, who are also working with the Saskatchewan Environmental Society and CJS. So that should be a great conversation. Two super interesting people that know have a lot of knowledge to share. So
yeah, thanks for getting that, Lauren.
Yeah, well, we hope that you'll be able to join us then. And until then, thank you for joining us, and we hope you enjoyed this.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks so
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate it.
Are we just signing off now?
Yeah.
Just checking.